The non-belief is incoherent omnibus. Number 12. The argument from Bayesian epistemology. Premise 1. According to Bayesian principles, individuals implicitly assign probabilities to propositions based on available evidence. Bayesian probability theory describes the degrees of belief that rational agents should hold, and these beliefs are updated as new evidence is obtained. Premise 2. The assignment of probabilities indicates a degree of credence or belief in the propositions. In Bayesian theory, the assignment of probabilities is interpreted as a degree of belief or credence that a rational agent holds about the truth of a proposition. Conclusion. Therefore, it is reasonable to infer that the complete absence of belief in a proposition, as distinct from belief in the negation, is merely an abstract hypothetical concept, as individuals inherently assign some degree of credence to propositions.
The argument under consideration attempts to establish that non-belief is logically incoherent by appealing to Bayesian principles. That individuals inherently assign probabilities to propositions and that this constitutes a degree of credence which in turn implies a belief. However, this reasoning is flawed, due to conflations between probability and epistemology, and an unjustified leap from credences to belief. In this critique I will counter the argument on all points and thus give a solid refutation. Let's look at the first premise. According to Bayesian principles, individuals implicitly assign probabilities to propositions based on available evidence. I don't know of any principle that would lead an individual to implicitly assign a probability to a proposition. There's a bit of ambiguity whether the author is speaking of Bayesian probability or Bayesian epistemology. In the first case, we are talking in terms of objective likelihood based on evidence. Assigning probabilities is actually a rather explicit affair. Individuals deliberately choose prior probabilities based on available evidence. In the latter case of epistemology, we are talking about a subjective degree of belief in a proposition, more accurately described as the credence assigned to the proposition. While the credence might seem implicit because it's based on a subjective value, it still involves a conscious, explicit judgment rather than something automatic or implicit. In both cases, the premise fails. Individuals explicitly assign probabilities to propositions and individuals explicitly assign credences to propositions. The fact that the quote from James doesn't appear in the cited work weakens the argument overall. Instead of supporting the premise, it brings the premise further into suspicion. This false citation coupled with the ambiguity ought to lead to anyone rejecting the premise as invalid. Moving on to the second premise, the assignment of probabilities indicates a degree of credence in the propositions. This premise suffers from the same sickness as the first, in that the quote does not appear in the cited work. This ought to disqualify the premise and thus the entire argument, but let us consider the premise on its own merits, absent the false citation. Impressively, the premise conflates probabilities with credence and credence with beliefs. The fact that a person assigns a probability to a proposition doesn't entail that person holds a particular belief about the proposition, nor does it entail that they hold a specific degree of credence towards the proposition. First, assigning a probability can be a purely mechanical operation. If someone is applying Bayes' theorem, they can make the calculation without adopting any belief about the proposition. For example, consider a chemist assigning a probability to a hypothesis that a given molecule will evaporate given a specific temperature and time. The chemist need not commit to believing or disbelieving it. They are simply working within a probabilistic framework, dispassionately handling data. Second, credence is a different propositional attitude than belief or disbelief. Credence is a subjective measure of confidence in a proposition, whereas belief is a psychological commitment to a proposition. Although you could say that high credence, say CP 0.9, might often justify belief, the two aren't interchangeable. Yet even this threshold is still subject to circumstances. Assigning a probability to a given proposition does not necessarily indicate a given credence towards the proposition. The chemist assigning a probability is not assigning a credence, they are simply performing a calculation. The two are distinct acts. Because assigning a probability to a proposition entails nothing about the credence or belief in the matter, the premise fails on its own merits. Conclusion: therefore it is reasonable to infer that the complete absence of belief in a proposition, as distinct from belief in the negation, is merely an abstract hypothetical concept, as individuals inherently assign some degree of credence to propositions. The conclusion seems to say that because individuals assign a degree of credence to a proposition, it follows that they hold a belief in the proposition, and as a separate clause within the conclusion that it is reasonable to infer that a lack of belief in the proposition is in actuality belief in its negation. First, I would like to address the rhetorical padding within the conclusion. I must ask, why is it reasonable to infer this? If the inference is there to be had, simply present it. If the conclusion is only reasonable and not sufficiently necessary, then it becomes subjective. There is no persuasive force that would compel anyone to accept it. It becomes a matter of preference and nothing more. It certainly seems as if the author is giving themselves permission to eat the last bit of pizza after already promising it to their friend. A permission to claim it is reasonable without demonstrating that it is. If the conclusion actually followed, the preface wouldn't be needed at all. I'll spoil the assessment and say, I have no reason to accept this. Demonstrate how it follows and then put it up to consider how reasonable it might be. It would certainly be unreasonably taxing to common sense and good rational inquiry to accept it without showing how it follows. Now I will address how, since the premises have failed, either having been proven false or being rejected as invalid due to false citation, the conclusion likewise fails. However, let us consider granting a generous allowance of charity and assume that the premises stand. Does assigning a credence to a proposition entail the impossibility of an absence of belief? No, credence is a different propositional attitude than belief. And assigning a credence does not necessitate committing to a belief in the proposition. Consider the classic shell game and magic trick, where a performer places a small ball underneath one cup of 3 and proceeds to shuffle the cups around until the audience loses track of the cup hiding the ball. Say a man named Jack is in the audience watching the performance when he's briefly distracted because he forgot to turn off his phone. Once his eyes leave the performance, Jack has surely lost track of the cup hiding the ball, no matter how vigilant he was previously. Jack has no reason to believe the ball is under any particular cup, so he divides his credence as such. C. Ball is under right, equals 1/3, about 33%. C. Ball is under middle, equals 1/3, about 33%. C. Ball is under left, equals 1/3, about 33%. Despite having assigned credences, Jack does not believe the ball is under any specific cup and remains in a state of non-belief regarding any one of these propositions. The performance continues with the performer revealing the contents of the middle cup as empty and tossing it aside. With this new information, Jack's credences obviously change. The confidence he had in the middle proposition are distributed to the right and left. Except, Jack remembers that this is a magic performance. There is a real possibility that the ball isn't under the remaining cups. Therefore he adjusts his credences as such. C. Ball is under right, equals 49%. C. Ball is under left, equals 49%. C. Ball is gone due to sleight of hand, equals 2%. Before the magic trick is revealed, Jack has to leave the performance due to a family emergency. His teenage son crashed the car. Obviously that takes attention away from the show, and he never resolves under which cup, if any, the ball was under. He never obtains a belief from the confidence he held. He's got more important things to consider. The key point is this: credences are a measure of confidence, not commitment. Belief is a psychological commitment to a proposition. One can have a credence without any commitment, thus without belief. The argument ultimately collapses under scrutiny. The premises can be discounted as inaccurate or invalid, supported by misrepresented sources and ambiguous wording that conflates Bayesian probability with epistemology. Even if we grant the premises, the conclusion doesn't follow. At best, the premises suggest that individuals assign some level of credence to propositions, but this does not rise to the level of belief.